afternoon and welcome to the Behavioral Health Talk series, hosted by Children's Hospital New Orleans. Today we are joined by Parent Educator Ms. Monet Somerville from the Parenting Center here at Children's Hospital. The topic for today's talk series will be the impact of the parent-child relationship. We ask for all invited guests to please use the chat box to ask any questions throughout today's session. We will address these questions throughout the segment as well as the end of today's segment. So I will turn this over to Ms. Monet Somerville.
Thank you. Again, my name is Ms. Monet Somerville. I am one of the parent educators here at the Parenting Center at Children's Hospital, and I'm so excited to talk to you today about the impact of the parent-child relationship and how important it is for overall development. So before we get started, I want to make sure that we're all clear about what we're actually going to be talking about. So first, we're going to talk about what attachment is in infancy and adulthood. We're going to talk about what attachment behaviors are, how attachment impacts child development, and also what you can do to build attachment. So let's get started. So the first thing, let's talk about attachment. What do you think attachment is? If you can just write down one or two words about what attachment is, just think about it and write those words down. So if any of the words that you wrote down included something like connection, that's exactly what attachment is. It's simply a connection between two or more people. Have you seen this in your child or your children? And just keep that in your mind, because we're going to talk a lot about what attachment is and how it develops, and that's going to really help you frame what you're seeing in your children. So this is how attachment develops. It is a wonderful cycle that happens 1,000 times over and over and over again during the first year of life. And what happens, if we look at the very top of our cycle, it says needs expressed. Children or infants express their needs through crying. That's a signal that they are distressed, which is that inner circle on the right-hand side. And then as parents and caregivers, we come in and we meet that need in a nurturing way. And that provides that child with comfort. And when I say nurturing care, what I really mean is loving care that is actually showing the child that you're interested in what's happening to them at that moment and you're trying to help them. But if we look at the two outer sections of each side of that cycle, you see where it says sympathetic nervous system and excitatory neurotransmitters under distress, right? So when they're distressed, what happens on the inside of them is their sympathetic nervous system gets activated. And what that system does is it increases breathing, heart rate, it can dilate pupils, and it just hypes the body up. And in that process, excitatory neurotransmitters are being released in the brain, like adrenaline and cortisol, which is our wonderful stress hormone, right? So once we have those two things happening in this distress cycle, a parent or caregiver comes in, they nurturingly meet that need, whatever that need may be, whether it's they're hungry, tired, lonely, they need a new diaper, whatever their need is, it's being met in a nurturing way. That activates what's called our parasympathetic nervous system. And that helps to bring the body down. So it decreases blood pressure, it decreases heart rate, it decreases breathing back to a normal level. But in that process, inhibitory neurotransmitters are also released, such as dopamine and serotonin. And those essentially bring the brain back to a normal state. And then the cycle starts all over again. So let's think about this, right? A need is expressed, the baby starts crying. We see that as their little cheeks get red, they're crying, their little hearts start pounding. We come in, let's say they need a diaper change. Oh my goodness, you need a diaper change. Let's get that dirty diaper off and get a new one so we can be all clean. That process of talking and actually changing the diaper helps that baby to start calming down. Their little faces go back to a normal color. They stop crying. And even a lot of times they'll start smiling and laughing. And that's when we know that they are experiencing that comfort. But there are times where a child can get stuck on that distress side. So they never really have that nurturing care that they need to experience that comfort level. And that's where a lot of issues can occur. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. So children aged 9 to 18 months are classified into two types of attachment: secure and insecure attachment. And this is determined when we observe how a child responds when their parent or caregiver leaves a room and then returns. This classification also tells us the type and consistency of care that's given. So whether or not they were consistently getting nurturing care or not getting nurturing care. So let's look at the classifications a little bit more in depth. So a securely attached child means that the caregiver is providing consistent nurturing care. And what this looks like when a caregiver leaves the room and then comes back is the child clearly is very distressed when the parent or caregiver leaves the room. But when they come back, they're easily consoled by that caregiver, and they really want to be close to that caregiver. So they'll reach up to be held and want to snuggle with that caregiver at that point when they return. Because they've learned over time through that attachment cycle that when I have a need, which is I'm afraid because you're gone, that creates that distress, and then you come back and you comfort me, that whole cycle is complete at that point. So that's how the secure attachment plays out. Insecure attachments, though, is not as simple. It's broken down into three different categories. The first one is ambivalent. So an ambivalent attachment is where the caregiver inconsistently responds to the child. Sometimes the caregiver is loving and nurturing, and other times either they don't meet that need or they don't even try to meet that need, but it's met, if it is met, it's met in a negative way. So with these children, what we see is that the child is extremely distressed when the caregiver leaves, and they'll want comfort when their caregiver comes back, but they're unsure about whether or not their caregiver is capable of giving it to them at that point. So you'll see them lean into their caregiver and then start pushing away. And a lot of times we'll see this go back and forth a few times before we actually see them calm down. This child is actually very, very difficult to console. So if we put it into a number, let's say a securely attached child may be calmed down in about 10 to 20 seconds. An insecurely attached child, especially an ambivalent child, may take a minute, 2 minutes to calm down fully. And this kind of, gives us the idea of what they're experiencing as an infant. The next insecure attachment is called avoidant. And this is where the caregiver does not respond in a nurturing way to that child. That does not mean that that child's basic needs are not being met, though. So you can meet a child's needs, but not do it in a nurturing way. And that's what these children experience. And what we see when a caregiver leaves is that there's no sign of distress. The child doesn't cry, they don't whimper, they don't even acknowledge that their caregiver has left. But when that caregiver comes back, there's still no acknowledgement that the caregiver has come back. But what we do really want to see is in between that return, when the caregiver leaves and when they return, is that we see these children become hyper-focused or extremely focused on either toys or objects that are in the room. And this essentially has been taught to this child through multiple interactions with their caregiver that people are not trustworthy. There are not going to be people to help me meet my needs, so I need to learn how to meet my needs, and things are going to be more consistent. So it was interesting in one study, they found that when parents were presented with all of these attachment styles and they were asked which one did they prefer, almost 50% of caregivers said that they preferred the avoidant attached child. And this is interesting because avoidantly attached children, when they're going through that separation point, their cortisol levels or their stress hormones are about double what we would expect to see. So that is huge. That just means that this child is extremely stressed out in this moment, yet because of how their behavior is, they're appearing to be very independent. Our final insecure attachment is called disorganized, and this is where the caregiver is frightening or harmful. And what we see in these children when the caregiver leaves or when they return, this child doesn't have any clear pattern of how they're trying to get their needs met. So just like we have an ambivalent child will lean in and then push away and then lean back in and push away, that's a consistent pattern. But the disorganized child has a different unknown pattern. So they may hit their heads, they may slam their bodies on the ground, they may stand there and stare into space like they're frozen. And these are just some of the common symptoms that we see for a disorganized child. So let's jump from infant attachment to adult attachment. Attachment is not something that we outgrow. It continues throughout the life cycle for us. And infant attachment just gives us a framework about ourselves. It gives us a framework of the world and how we function within that world. So there are adult attachment styles that are linked with infant attachment. The difference is that adult attachment is not measured the same way as infant attachment. Adult attachment is measured through anxiety of abandonment and avoidance of close relationships. So let's take a look at this. Okay, so if we have a securely attached infant, that typically translates into a securely attached adult. And if you look at the chart on the left, the top left corner is where we see the secure attachment, and that's low anxiety and low avoidance. Okay, so that means that they are okay with being alone. They don't have that intense fear of I'm going to be abandoned, but they also don't have avoidance of close relationships. They can interact with other people and be okay. At the bottom left, we have the dismissive, and dismissive comes from the avoidant child. Remember that avoidant child is the one who did not get that nurturing care, right? So they have high avoidance. They have learned, just like I said before, that things are more trustworthy than people, and they have low anxiety. So they're not anxious about being abandoned, but rather they just don't want to deal with people at all. If we look at our top right, that's where we call the entangled or preoccupied. And this is where a person who was ambivalent as an infant, which means simply that they did not get that consistent nurturing care. They have low avoidance and high anxiety. So if you think about a helicopter parent, that's kind of where this person fits in with their attachment. And the final one, disorganized, leads to an unresolved or fearful avoidant, which is at the bottom right corner. And they are high in both anxiety and avoidance. We're going to talk a little bit later on about what the behaviors look like for each one of these attachment styles. So our early experiences with our parents and caregivers lays the foundation for certain behaviors. And these are commonly known as attachment behaviors. Okay, so at the bottom right corner, we see that attachment cycle again. So we have that need, it's expressed, and it's showing a sense of distress in our sympathetic nervous system, and excitatory neurotransmitters get kicked in. That need is met, and then we experience that comfort, the activation of our parasympathetic and inhibitory neurotransmitters. Right? So that whole cycle is continuous throughout our lifespan. Okay? So let's look at what attachment is really foundational for. So let's look at trust, self-worth, and self-efficacy. And this is essentially what lays the foundation when we experience distress, having that nurturing care and getting our needs met, and then that comfort. That cycle, that inner circle cycle, is what creates trust. There are safe people who will meet my needs or to help me meet my own needs. So as children get older, they shift from being dependent to being independent. So that's where we come up with the idea of there are people to help me meet my needs. Self-worth is that I'm worthy of love and care. Someone loved me enough and cared about me enough to continuously meet my needs. And that's where that idea comes from. And then self-efficacy. I have a voice and it means something. Or as we get older, it can also mean I have the abilities I need to accomplish something, whatever that thing is. Okay, so if we kind of shift out just a little bit to that second outer circle where we talk about our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, that creates a cycle of self-regulation, right? I can control myself. So if we think about a child who is stressed out on the first day of school, right? To help regulate themselves, they may suck their thumb instead of standing there crying, or they may be able to use their blanket to comfort themselves to get over this little stress point, right? That's a part of self-regulation. If we think about a child who has a new sibling and that older child starts to become very clingy with their parents, that's a part of self-regulation because they're reaching out and saying, I need help in this moment to help me regulate my emotions. And if we shift out to that last outer part of excitatory neurotransmitters and inhibitory neurotransmitters, that's where we get the foundation for mental health, or the idea that I can cope with good and bad experiences. And what this does is if we think about the psychotropic medications that are used, right, especially SSRIs, which are serotonin reuptake inhibitors, that's where this kind of process comes in, because when we have that activation of excitatory neurotransmitters and then we get that need met and we have that activation of inhibitory neurotransmitters, that inhibitory neurotransmitter of serotonin floods our brain and relaxes our bodies. So that's kind of the idea that we're looking at. Okay, and then strict attachment behaviors that we see in adulthood, the ability to give care, the ability to receive care, the ability to negotiate your needs and be autonomous, or in other words, to be independent. Okay, so let's kind of shift and see what this really looks like in an insecurely attached adult. So securely attached adults can do all of those things. They have trust, they have self-worth, they have self-efficacy, they can give care, receive care, negotiate their needs, be independent. They have all of those abilities, right? But an insecurely attached adult does not necessarily have that. So if we think about the dismissive adult, they're closed off emotionally because remember, they find things more trustworthy than people. The physical affection does not come naturally to them. They don't know what that's like because they never really experienced it. And they put energy into objects and not people, okay? So if we think about the behaviors that we just looked at, they may have trouble giving care. They may have trouble receiving care. They may also have trust issues. The fearful avoidant, they have difficulty with all four of the attachment behaviors. So giving care, receiving care, negotiating needs, and being independent. They just don't know how to do that. The entangled or preoccupied adult attachment, they have difficulty negotiating their needs, difficulty being independent or autonomous. They have intrusive care. It's like that helicopter parent that we think about. They get close to others very quickly. And they may have anger or resentment towards their parents or caregivers. And the final one, the unresolved, this is where we see dissociative behaviors, where people drink or use drugs to escape their reality. We also see behavior disorders, emotional disorders, and those sound like depression, anxiety. Sometimes we see multiple personality disorders in there, but their relationships are typically chaotic and confusing. So I want you to stop for a quick second. I want you to think about where you may fall in your attachment. Do any of these things sound familiar to you? So now that we have discussed what attachment is and what it looks like, let's talk about how infant attachment develops into adult attachment. So we're going to look at specifically how attachment impacts that child development. And it can impact many areas of development, but I just want to focus on three: cognitive, psychosocial, or who am I and how do I fit into this world, and language development. So let's start with cognitive. Attachment, healthy attachment or secure attachment helps to develop all the regions of the brain, including this prefrontal cortex, that front part of the brain that we really, really need, because that's where our executive functioning is. And executive functioning is essentially higher levels of thinking, being able to think about consequences before they happen, or think about how I can help someone or be empathetic to someone else. It can also impact the development of our instinctual responses. So our stress response, that system of the sympathetic nervous system and its excitatory neurotransmitters, and having those activated and knowing how to deactivate those things and be able to put together, okay, this is a stressful situation, but it's not a dangerous situation. Being able to process those things out. That's what we try to do. When we have that secure attachment, those are the kind of things that can come up. When we look at psychosocial development, what research has shown us is that a secure attachment is important for identity development as well as intimacy development. Secure attachment is related to a strong identity development, meaning that teens learn who they are. For intimacy development, research shows that intimacy can be predicted by self-efficacy, which develops through secure attachment and low attachment avoidance. Essentially, having a secure attachment can predict normal intimacy development. It can also help with developing social skills to work with others, such as turn taking and effective communication. It'll help to build self-regulation skills. We talked about that in the previous slides. And it also is a foundation for good mental health. For language development, it explodes during the ages of 0 to 3. And that's the same time when we're seeing that attachment develop, okay? Attachment can develop expressive language, which is how we express ourselves, how we talk, how we write. Also, it impacts our receptive language, which is processing when we're being spoken to or being asked to do something. So there was one case study called Jeannie, and she was locked in a room for most of her life. The first 13 years of her life, she would be transferred from a cage-like bed onto a toilet and left there all day. And that was just her life cycle for the first 13 years. She was never spoken to. And of course, that means she never developed a healthy attachment. And when they actually found her and were able to pull her out of that home, what they found is that over time, she never really learned to talk. She would be able to say a few things, but expressive language was never really fully developed. And how she processed what people were saying to her or telling her, or asking her to do, she couldn't really process out very well. So we also need to make note that children also mimic your language. So if you're talking in a specific tone of voice, whether that's yelling, whether that's being a calm, funny tone, children are going to mimic that. But they also mimic exactly what you say. So if you curse, your children are going to learn how to curse. So this was a lot of good information up to this point. So I want to take a quick stopping point. I want you to think about where your child is in development. I want you to think about why you think that they're there. Is there something in your relationship do you feel like has helped get them to that point? Now I want you to think about how you've helped them to develop a healthy attachment to you. What are some things that you've done on a regular basis to help build that connection? Building attachment can happen at any point in life. There are two things to remember about attachment. It's adaptable, and mindset is a very important part to this. The adaptability of attachment also means that if you don't immediately respond to your child every single time, that does not damage the relationship. In fact, research has shown that being overly attentive can be damaging because it does not give the child the opportunity to learn independence. Many times parents feel that if they yell at their child or have a bad day, that damages the relationship. But in fact, the recovery from those instances are what builds stronger relationships. So being able to come back and say, I'm sorry, I should not have yelled, helps to build that connection with your child. If we think about mindset, being mindful, it just means to bring your full attention to that present moment. This means that you are aware of how your history is impacting you in the interaction with your child at any given moment. So what are some things that you can do to build, repair, or maintain a good attachment with your child beyond what you're doing now? Well, let's talk about that. These are engagement strategies. Okay, and these are just some simple things that you can do on an everyday basis to help build that connection, repair it, or maintain it. So healthy touch. This is simply gentle touch, such as a chin prompt for them to look at you, or holding their hand. If you have an infant, doing a little baby massage, or just giving them a hug can be so helpful because it helps to release those inhibitory neurotransmitters that relax the brain and the body. Eye contact, right? When we look at someone, that can tell us a whole lot about that person. So if somebody is looking at you with an angry face or an angry eye stare, that's not gonna ignite those calming sensations that we want in our bodies. That's gonna ignite that stress, right? So having gentle eyes, think about how you feel. Okay, that's one of the biggest things in attachment is thinking about how you feel when somebody does something to you. And if you don't like how that feels, do the opposite with your child. The other thing is voice quality. Be mindful of how you are speaking, as this is just as important as what you're saying. Yelling or having a raised voice can trigger the distress cycle for some children and even some adults. Behavior matching. Mimic your child's behavior, such as wearing the same colored clothes. Think about how it feels when your child mimics you in a sweet way, okay? Like if they try to wear your shoes and walk around the house. Playful interaction. Play games that they enjoy. For younger children, it may be hide and seek. For older children, you can ask them to teach you about their favorite game and play it with them. And these are proven methods to repair relationships when you have a bad day and makes you more mindful of your everyday interactions with your kids. So that was a lot of information about attachment and how it can impact every aspect of life. But there are some basic things that I want you to come away with from this presentation. One is your own attachment style can impact your relationship with your child and ultimately the attachment style of your child. Attachment can impact many areas of development in children. Just because you have an insecure attachment does not mean that your child will be insecurely attached. Being mindful of what's going on in the moment is beneficial to addressing this situation. Using engagement strategies can help build secure attachments with your children. And finally, it's never too late. It's never too late to build that attachment and repair your relationship with your child, whether that child is a teenager, a grown adult, or even an infant. It's never too late to start. So let's kind of review what our objectives were for this class. We talked about what attachment is in infancy as well as adulthood, and we actually showed what the connections were between those two. We talked about what attachment behaviors are. Remember that giving care, receiving care, negotiating needs, being autonomous. We also talked about trust, self-efficacy, self-worth, self-regulation, and mental health. How attachment impacts child development. We only talked about 3 domains of development of cognitive, psychosocial, and language development, but it impacts so much more at times. And we also talked about what you can do to build attachment. If you have any additional questions later, you can always call the Parenting Center at 504-896-9591 or email us at chparenting@lcmchealth.org.
Thank you so much, Monet, for today's presentation. I did receive a couple of questions in our chat. I will go ahead and read the first one. As a single parent of 3, it's often difficult to find enough time to spend with each child. This was never a case years back. However, as time has moved on, it's been harder to give more and more attention to each child. But also, I wonder in which ways can I provide that attention but not take away too much time that I could spend personally with myself. I know as a parent of 3, it's often difficult to strategize what to do. Can you give me some feedback for that?
For that situation, I would recommend scheduling time for each one of your kids and then scheduling time for yourself, because in that scheduled time, your only focus is on that child. So no phones, no other distractions, no other kids. So if you can get a babysitter or the other parent takes, or another caregiver can come and get the other 2, just to spend that quality time with one child at a time, and allow that child to actually pick the activity that you do. That can also be helpful. And just kind of go with it and enjoy that moment with that child. And making sure that you also, just like I said a couple of seconds ago, is making time for your own self-care, because that is important. You have to fill your own cup and meet your own needs in order to be able to meet the needs of your children.
Thank you so much for that. Another question that did come in: as a foster parent, I didn't experience attachment with my child as an infant. What is the best approach for building attachment with a teen who seems very closed off?
Oh, that's a little difficult. But teenagers are, if we think about where they are developmentally, they're essentially big toddlers. They're still trying to figure out who they are, what they can do, what they can't do. And what I would recommend is giving that teen some sense of control over certain things that they like safely can be in control of. So whether that's planning the meal for the evening or planning an activity, kind of go with what they want. One of the things I used to always do is tell me about this TV show that you're watching and let them talk it out. And then just sit and watch that show with that child and let him or her just kind of be in that moment, be the expert. And that can kind of help to build that connection, because at that point you're not dictating all the time. You're stopping and you're listening and you're giving that child or that teen your full attention.
Thank you so much for that insight and feedback with some of these questions. So that's gonna do it with all the questions in the chat box. I want to thank everyone who attended today. We appreciate all of the questions that you all sent and all of the additional comments that were made upon registration. Again, if you have any additional questions that come about, please feel free to contact the Parenting Center. And I want to thank our presenter today who did a wonderful job.
Thank you.